What started off as a routine stop in the streets of Minneapolis in the U.S. has turned into one of the largest race discrimination protests since the Black Civil Rights Movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. But the question is, will this make a difference? What is for certain is that skin color should not be a factor in the modern world, but hidden behind the very public protests taking place all over the globe is a hidden truth, namely that the black-white wealth gap is still as wide as it ever was.
I lost my job because I was working at the retail store, and then it closed down because of this whole coronavirus. Like, it's crazy. Then my baby father lost his job, and it's crazy. I don't know what's going on.
One only has to look at various institutions around the world, particularly within the developed world and the so-called integrated countries, to realize that from education to healthcare and from housing to careers, the gap between black and white people is clear to see.
For each generation, I think it has slightly improved for us, but we're still way off the mark in terms of where we need to be for genuine, true equality. And I think that this new generation, this younger generation, they're not as tolerant as we have been, as docile as we've been, to allow, the nonsense to continue. And, we want change. We all want change.
Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavitaf Waib. In this week's episode of the show, we will be looking into the gap between races, particularly within the more developed countries, and examine just how deep the divide is, and whether the death of George Floyd will be the catalyst to ending black and white racial discrimination. Don't forget that we want to hear from you about how this topic has affected your life. Have you missed out on a job due to your skin color? Are you earning less than your colleagues because of your race? Visit our Twitter page @ED_program and let us know. This is your chance to share your story. Now, let's take a look at income inequality in the U.S. For starters, the U.S. has the world's income inequality ratio within the G7 nations, which, according to a measuring system called the Gini coefficient, it scores 0.434. To compare how bad that is, the global average is actually 0.25, showing the U.S. is failing badly when it comes to equality. Since 1970 to the present day, the black-white income gap has remained pretty steady, with the average black family earning only 61% of a white median income, whereas a white middle-class family will see its main earner topping $81,000 per year. A black middle-class family will only see $51,000 per year. Now, taking a bigger picture across the U.S., including both those in work and out of work, as well as assets owned, now the striking difference is very actually obvious. And that's with a typical white family having a net worth of nearly 10 times that of a black family, averaging around $171,000 for whites compared to just $17,150 for black families. Truly saddening, I'm sure you will agree.
Whether it be in the United States of America, the UK, or anywhere else, where black and white people are living together, there's a clear line drawn between people. Ever since the days of the slave trade, where white merchants and landowners forced Africans from their homes and shipped them to plantations around the Americas under conditions that were subhuman, the racial differences between people have continued to be exploited by whites, many of whom, and very sadly, see black people as different or inferior. Although slavery has now long been abolished, the discrimination that existed back then is still very much obvious today, with black people rarely given the same opportunities as others when it comes to multiple social rights. For example, in the educational field, a typical black American will score below 75% of an American white on almost all standardized tests. It's also a well-known fact that black students are less likely than their white peers to graduate from high school or college in the United States. The discrimination against black people in the US does not stop at education, but it's also extended into the healthcare system, where figures show that white Americans have better insurance and access to healthcare than their black peers. In fact, with black and ethnic minorities in the US having less than 50% of the numbers of insured people than whites. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, saw far more black people in the US struggling to gain access to healthcare than white people, raising the debate as to why more black people were becoming affected in the first place, ultimately paying with their lives. The fact that so many of those affected did not have insurance and came from black ethnic backgrounds further goes on to prove that there's a significant gap between black and whites in the US social systems, raising again the question as to why this is the case and whether the discrimination is deliberate or simply a lack of opportunity for blacks.
When one looks at the economic stats on whites and blacks, the gap becomes quite evident. Take, for example, the unemployment figures. The unemployment rate for black Americans exceeds those of whites, with blacks coming in at 16.7%, while whites come in at 14.2%. Now, the poverty rate is a big one. The poverty rate for black Americans is more than double that of whites. The black poverty rate stands at 20.8%, almost 21%, while for whites, that figure stands at only 8.1%. Then comes health care. A larger share of black Americans actually lack health insurance compared to whites. The figures stand at 5.4% for whites compared to blacks, which stands at 9.7%. This was particularly noticeable during the COVID-19 outbreak, when the virus ravaged black communities in terms of deaths and infections.
It's very simple to see from the educational division between white and blacks in the US that the chances of obtaining and securing a high-paid and well-respected job is going to be a hard task. In terms of race disparity between black and white students in American universities, white students are graduating at a rate of around 62%, compared to only 38% of black students. That's nearly half the amount. So why then is this the case? As we saw earlier, education from an early age plays an important part in securing a good place at university, and from here, the chances of finding a good job following graduation also completes the chain. But in terms of careers, the black folk of the US are generally held back from regular positions that most people can get. Of course, there are exceptions, with the likes of Barack Obama and Colin Powell showing that people can reach the top, but they're more the exception to the rule than the normality. Lower down the social ladder, within places such as the service and leisure sector, the roles are being filled by black and ethnic minority races in the US, as well as in UK, Europe, and beyond.
Blacks have always been a critical component of the American labor force, but they have always been at the bottom. And we have always fought against that. In the community, there is always anger and frustration. And in the African American community, struggle and resistance has become a cultural tradition.
When also one looks at the majority of multinational corporations around the world, one also starts to notice that much like the corridors of power in the political system, the business world also has corridors that are very much painted white. Will the protests and globally emulated demand for more rights for black people therefore change not only the way that blacks are treated by the police, but also the way in which we see equal rights and equal opportunities for black people in the workplace? That is something that will become apparent over the next few months, provided that the Black Lives Matter marches demand that this issue is addressed as well.
Joining me in the studio today is Otelia Kunene. She's a writer, activist, and commentator on social affairs from Johannesburg, South Africa. Now, she has written articles for numerous online journals and has campaigned for the group Right to Know and Keep Left. Well, Otelia, many thanks for joining us today here on Economic Divide.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be part of this program.
Yes, so are we. Our first question to you, how do you think lives have changed for black people in South Africa since the end of the apartheid regime? I mean, do you think that since then have things improved in your assessment?
Things haven't necessarily improved, particularly for the black people in South Africa. I think there's this large feeling around how certain systems have changed from colonialism to apartheid and now to capitalism. There's a sense that all these systems are not there to improve people's lives or to improve Black people's lives, but they are there to just maintain the oppression, but in different forms. So we're just saying that things haven't changed and people are still struggling because South Africa is also one of the most unequal societies in the world. So that should clearly give you a picture that nothing has changed, but for the Black majority particularly, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer as well.
Well, looking at this, obvious question comes to mind, the wealth gap between Black and white people.
South Africa is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of producing minerals. We produce coal and we produce gold and platinum and all of those things. But unfortunately, what is largely produced in South Africa is for the minority, which is, the white elite, the small white elite. So, as I mentioned before, that, the white people are, or the minority in South Africa are getting richer, but, the poor people in the country are also getting poorer, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're still having a continuous conversation of economic transformation in South Africa. The land issue as well, that the land needs to go back to the natives. Even the issue of the economy, that the economy needs to go back to the natives as well, because currently 80% of land is owned by white people in South Africa. Even 80% of the economy is owned by white people in South Africa as well. So the gap is huge. There is no way that the poor people in South Africa can actually reach to the middle of the gap. That's why we also say that in South Africa we don't have a middle class, because it's just the poor and the rich, because the middle class people, the middle class group in South Africa are largely in debt.
Well, looking at my final question at what happened to George Floyd and his death in the U.S., what's going to happen? Is the world now waking up to that? And how is that going to affect South Africa?
The world woke up to racism a long time ago. I think the issue is just that it's very hard for people to give out or to give out their privilege. It's very hard to now give out what you used to or your privileged life so that you can actually normalize certain things. But also one thing that I need to applaud, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement or with George Floyd, is the fact that, he has started a revolution. And that's one of the most important things, that, we are now receiving socialism from below, or rather we are now, people from below are now waking up, and now they're addressing the issue of capitalism or this system that we are in. Now people are waking up and people want a revolution and people want a system change, because it's very clear that the system is not working for them completely.
Okay, thank you so much, Orthelia Kunene from Johannesburg in South Africa. Many thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Orthelia Kunene there from Johannesburg in South Africa. We're about to take a short break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere, because coming up, we're going to take a look at the demographics of Black and white families in the U.S. and study whether certain communities are more favorably placed than others. We're also going to take a look at the racial discrimination and economic inequality across the rest of the world, looking in particular at Britain, which, like the U.S., also has a huge gap between the blacks and whites there when it comes to money. We're also joined in the studio by our regular current affairs and impact analyst, Mahan Abedin, who will be taking us through events happening in the world of social media. Also a look at other economic headlines hitting the front pages of the media around the world. So stay right where you are. We'll be right back. Time to take a look at other economic news stories from around the world, starting with an oil and gas story. Now, UK petroleum giant BP has stated that they have lost $17 billion in assets as the oil price slump hits. They also stated that Brent crude could see prices remain less than $55 per barrel for decades to come. Looking at the effect of the COVID-19 on economies is disastrous. But did you know how bad it has impacted countries? Here's a snapshot of some of the stats on different economies. First, the French economy is set to shrink by 20% in the second quarter, as the recession there has deepened. Next, the UK economy shrank more than 20% in April. Then, Spain's economy fell 34% in the first 2 weeks of the coronavirus lockdown back in March. And finally, the US economy shrank 4.8% as coronavirus ended that country's longest expansion in history. The GDP is predicted to fall at an annualized 30% in the next quarter. Crossing on over to Latin America, yearly investments there looks dismal. It is forecast to halve from $164 million per year, as both the impact of the coronavirus and political caution sees foreign investment figures drop dramatically. And finally, global banking giant HSBC has announced that it is to cut some 35,000 jobs as part of its plan to recover from the impact of the coronavirus on its affairs and assets. The UK branch of the bank alone will see some 50% of the jobs lost as part of the recovery plan. Let's now take a look as to whether demographics play a part in the black-white financial divide.
The environment in which we are born plays a vital role in the way we live, study, work, and interact within a society. Therefore, the argument that for those coming from privileged backgrounds succeed more than others is a clear indication of success. But for those living in conditions where opportunity is scarce, poverty is rife, and life is lived on a daily basis, how then do those who want to escape such a system do so? It's clear that opportunity and demographics play a huge role, as demonstrated in this clip.
Line up, everybody line up. We're about to race. Before I say go, I'm gonna make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. If you didn't learn anything from this activity.
When one looks at the demographics of black people in nations such as the US and the UK, one can also see that segregation is more obvious than ever. Areas in the US, such as Compton in Los Angeles, or Brixton in London, or Saint-Denis in Paris, have almost become ghetto-like in their structures, meaning that the outside world is almost inaccessible to those who want to escape. The 3 examples mentioned above also have abnormally high crime rates, drug use, and violence as part of their everyday lives, meaning that the police and security forces act in a heavy-handed way against the people that live there, often leading to huge barriers between the police and such communities.
My brothers have had police interactions that were not favorable for nothing more than 3 men together. And in America, 3 black men or more is deemed a threat. This is a problem.
Time now to have Mahan Abedin join us. He's our current affairs and impact analyst. Mahan, tell us about this wealth gap between the blacks and the whites. Is it as wide as perhaps what we're reporting in this program?
Well, it's probably much wider actually, and of course the US is the focal point of the racial equality protests, and just looking at the facts and figures, the gap couldn't be starker. In fact, it's been at its widest now for 3 decades. 10% of whites live below the poverty line, while for blacks it's 26%. So very stark difference in terms of wealth distribution, and something that's clearly contributing to the racial equality protest and the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States.
Our next, or the next one that you chose also points to that direction.
Yes,
take a look at that.
But it has a longer time frame. So it says the gap has been unchanged for half a century, a very long time.
You would think maybe that source is wrong, but it's the Economist that's reporting that.
Yeah, and so in 1962, the wealth of whites was 7 times greater. And that's more or less the same according to The Economist, which means that there's been very little socio-economic mobility as far as Afro-Americans are concerned.
And that's why we're seeing, I think, huge protests, because this issue hasn't been dealt with in a sense.
Well, I mean, the thing that really sticks to my mind was the black lady who came on, I forget her name, and she gave this really passionate account of why looting is occurring, saying that although she wasn't condoning looting, it said it's occurring because we don't owe anything, we as the African American community. And even when we built up wealth in the early 20th century, they were burnt down as part of the race riots in Tulsa and other places. So that's the kind of ideological motivation for the disturbances.
Let's look at the last entry that you chose for this.
Yeah, so this is in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So black Americans are dying at 3 times the rate of white people. This is, broadly speaking, in line with trends all across the Western world, including in the UK, where there's a big scandal because ethnic minorities, notably people of African origin, have a much greater percentage of dying of the coronavirus than the white population. So in America, it's also a serious issue. But interestingly enough, it hasn't reached the same level of profile as it has in the UK, media profile in terms of reporting.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah,
Mohammed Abedin there, our current affairs and impact analyst.
The brutal and unnecessary murder of George Floyd sparked what is likely to be one of the largest anti-racism movements in recent history, not since the American Black Civil Rights Movement, led by Dr. Martin Luther King, or the rise of the ANC following the release of Nelson Mandela, has the world gathered in support of equality between races. The fact that the protests have spread across the world, far beyond the borders of the US, means that there's a notion that the winds of change are starting to emerge in the fight for racial equality.
Today's protests are the culmination of many generations of pain and long struggles for equality. Too little has changed over too many years. We owe it to those who have gone before, as well as those to come, to seize the moment at long last to demand fundamental change and insist upon it.
However, in spite of the increasing numbers of those rising to express their frustration at the extreme separation going on between the races across the world, there's also a strong sentiment of racism felt by right-wing, hard-line, white supremacist groups. London in particular has seen huge and very violent counter-demonstrations, with the likes of right-wing leaders such as Tommy Robinson urging hooligans to converge on London and show their support for white people, many of whom with statues allocated to them within London, glorifying their racist and colonial past.
If you're a lad, or you call yourself a lad, and you're a football lad, and you go to football and you give a at all about our country, our history, our culture, our identity, I expect you're going to be in London next Saturday.
The fact of the matter is that not only are people on an individual scale racist, but on a deeper scale, many institutions are equally racist, with the police leading the way in such acts, as demonstrated by the death of Floyd and many others who have succumbed to the evil eye of skin colour discrimination. With such hatred and sentiment still in place, how then can the ghosts of the past be removed and integration be finally accepted as part of a global village that we all now live in?
Many would have thought that the 21st century would have seen people living together as one, as the horrendous racial discrepancies of the past sink long into the history books. However, as we know, this is clearly not the case. The murder of George Floyd has sparked global condemnation of the treatment of black people in the U.S. and has seen nations around the world support the Black Lives Matter cause. But will this truly bring about an end to the discrimination against black people? It sees that the corridors of power around the world are very much painted white. And unless drastic change occurs in the near future, well, sadly, they look set to remain that way. Don't forget, you can watch this show again by logging on to our website, as well as catching up on all of our previous episodes. Furthermore, you can join us on Twitter and share your stories by using the hashtag @ED_program. That's just about does it for this week's show. I've been Kaveh Takway, and on behalf of the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.